Hello there, and welcome to the Time Machine with Trish and Mike. I am Mike, and
I am Trish.
And we are so glad you're with us. You're back for our second episode. Thank you for coming back. That means you actually liked our first episode, and you wanted more. So we are here to provide that for you. How you doing today, Trish?
I am doing good. Happy New Year. We're officially into the first week of 2021.
This is true. It is 2021 is no longer 2020, and I think that is something we will all be happy about. How's the new year been going for you so far?
So far, it's been great. It's been really chill. Just, getting ready for regular life to resume after the holiday break.
Yeah, that it will. It ramps up real fast, especially that's my thing when you get the holidays, like New Year's and stuff, like late in a week, like it is this year.
Mm-hmm.
Like when New Year's is on a Friday, it's kind of like pretty much for most people, Monday or Tuesday, boom, you're back at it. It's not like if New Year's was, say, like a Monday or a Tuesday or a Wednesday or something, maybe you have the rest of the week, and then you don't really have to get going again until the 5th or 6th of the month or whatever. But it's like, oh, hi, January
Not
3rd.
this year.
Boom. But 'tis what it is.
Yes, Monday will soon be here, and that's hard for my brain to compute because it just has felt like every day is Sunday since Christmas.
Yeah, I have no idea what day it is half the time during the week between Christmas and New Year's. And then when you get to the actual holidays themselves, I don't know what day it is. They don't even feel like days. They just feel like days that have no definition.
It's like kind of the post nap feeling. You're like, where am I? What's going on? Kind of sleepy, kind of not.
That's a good way to put it. Speaking of sleeping, we kind of did sleep on something. We do have an omission from last week's episode I want to correct. I started to mention Val Kilmer not being America's favorite Batman actor, and he in fact was not. I got 17%.
In a poll. I have to apologize because I'm the one that kind of distracted you, and then we went down another rabbit hole.
To be fair, we started talking about Val Kilmer's Batman. That led into me thinking of Batman Forever, which has Nicole Kidman in it, and I just lost all train of thought at that point. So it's really Nicole Kidman's fault.
Yeah. We'll put the blame solely on her.
We'll blame her. Nicole, thanks. Love your movies though, and your husband's music is great. Big fan. So Val Kilmer got 17% out of a poll. Christian Bale was number 1. Michael Keaton was number 2. George Clooney, Ben Affleck, and Val Kilmer. Interestingly enough, though, in this poll, Christian Bale got 39%, Michael Keaton 38%. So
very close.
I think those are pretty much 1-2 for everybody, I think. And then Clooney, Affleck, and Kilmer 19, 18, and 17% respectively. There's not a wide margin there between them, but Kilmer's last, and well,
kind of hurts.
Sorry, Val.
Ouch.
Yeah, but hope you had a good birthday last week.
That's true. I do hope he had a wonderful day.
Speaking of birthdays, that takes us to our lead topic today. Sir Sandford Fleming was born in Kirkcaldy, Scotland on January 7th, 1827. I know what all of you are thinking right now. Who is Sir Sandford Fleming? Now, Trish, you as a Canadian, you probably know who he is because he was an important person in Canadian history.
He's very important. So the Canadian government actually makes history minutes that are broadcast in between television shows and things like that. And we have a Sir Sandford Fleming history minute. My brother attended Sir Sandford Fleming College in Ontario. So he's pretty important around these parts.
Yes, I would say so. And once we get into just how important he is, not only to Canadian history, but to really world history, I think a lot more people are going to know who Sir Sandford Fleming was. Because let's be honest, if you have a university or a college named after you, you probably did something significant.
Well, and it's going to be interesting because some people are going to realize that Sir Sandford Fleming has impacted them every single day of their life without actually knowing it.
Exactly. And we are going to jump into that right now because it is time for us to talk about time.
Time zone specifically.
So Sanford Fleming is the person mostly responsible for us having time zones, a centralized units of time around the world.
Yeah, he was getting quite tired of every different major city having a different time zone or, well, a standard measure of time for themselves. And so he thought there had to be a better way.
Right. So basically, the way time was ran at a local level for the most part was usually
Hmm.
based off, like, a sundial,
Hmm.
basically, a solar clock. And this created issues when you got into train schedules. And Fleming was over in Ireland in 1876 and he missed a train. And so he had this idea to coordinate time between the world. So what he did was he took the world and using 15-degree longitudinal intervals, he created 24 1 hour sections or divisions.
Hmm.
Like basically if you cut the earth into 24 equal pieces,
Right.
each one,
We sectioned it off like an orange.
exactly. And that was his concept. So he pitched this at the International Meridian Conference in 1884, which, interestingly enough, the original purpose of that conference was actually to determine a set a meridian to use as a common zero point for navigation for map making purposes. At that conference, they decided to use the Greenwich meridian as the zero point for longitude. Interestingly enough, that France abstained from voting at this conference, and French maps used the Paris meridian as zero marker
Oh, of course they did.
for map making and for timekeeping up until the early 1900s.
Hmm.
And to this day, some French cartographers indicate the Paris meridian on maps.
Fascinating.
So you would think if we took the Earth and divided it into 24 sections, we would have 24 time zones because that just makes sense,
Yes.
right?
Hmm.
Not so fast, my friend. So most of these time zones are offset by a whole hour, but you
Right.
do have some who, over the course of time or doing business or whatever, created their own time zones in between these time zones.
Yeah, Canada has one guilty culprit of that.
Yes, up in your old neck of the woods, up in Newfoundland, they are actually one of these half time zones, if you will. They are set at 3.5 hours behind Universal Time, which is
Hmm.
what the time is at the prime meridian that we had just discussed. So the reason for that is St. John's, which is Newfoundland's capital, falls roughly between the Atlantic and Greenland time zones. So they were like, hey, we're not really this time zone. We're not really this time zone. We're going to be our own time zone.
Yep, just
Hence,
right there in the middle.
hence the 30-minute offset, or offset rather. India and Nepal are sort of in the middle of a time zone, so they set their own time zone as well to be in between. And here's where this one gets really interesting. Uh, In 1920, Nepal adopted Indian Standard Time, so they were on the half-hour offset
Hmm.
of the time. But then in 1986, Nepal decided to advance their clocks 15 minutes forward, creating Nepal Standard Time. So they are now at an offset of 45 minutes.
And did they ever explain this random 15 minutes? It seems so unusual.
Uh, you know, if I was a better podcast host, I'd have that answer for you. But I could not figure out why they did it, other than I guess to be unique. I'm not sure. So
Right. Well, and when we've been discussing it, there's usually a monetary reason behind some of these decisions. So
true.
that's probably a good
I
guess.
think, and when you get into some of these line shifts and whatnot, like particularly
Hmm.
here in America, several states have multiple time zones, but
Right.
when you look at them geographically, the time zone lines do make some sense because you could see where, it's maybe easier for them to be on a certain time zone
Hmm.
that may not be because, like, if you have a city that's in the corner of a state, it might make sense for them to be on the time zone of the neighboring state because they do more commerce or business with that state, so it
Exactly.
just
Yeah.
makes more sense. And the Chatham Islands, which are part of New Zealand, also have a 45-minute offset
Oh, that's
of
so
time
random.
zones.
30
Yeah,
minutes kind of makes sense. You're like, okay, you're right in the middle. I can
yeah.
understand it, but 45 minutes, that just is random
So China only has one time zone.
for their whole big wide country.
Yep. So despite their size, which if you were to follow the 24 sections,
Mhm.
China would probably have about 5 time zones all in all. The entire country is set to Beijing time. So the further west you go, rather than losing time, you stay on the same time. And this actually creates a very interesting scenario when you get to the Afghanistan Chinese border. You have to adjust your clock 3.5 hours.
That's a massive jump.
That is a huge jump in time. And of course, the half hour comes into play because Afghanistan, you guessed it, created their own time zone because
Oh.
they're kind of between two time zones.
Just to make it a little bit more confusing.
Exactly. And if you're not confused enough while listening to this discussion about time and probably wondering when it's time we're going to move on to another topic, maybe you wish you lived in Kiritimati in the Christmas Islands, part of the Republic of Kiribati, because in 1995 they moved to the west side of the international date line in the Pacific so that they would become one of the first inhabited places on Earth to celebrate the new year. And this was being done, of course, in 1995 to promote tourism for the upcoming new millennium.
Hmm.
So, despite being further east than Honolulu, Hawaii, they are actually a full 24 hours ahead of Honolulu.
Now that is some strange timey-wimey stuff.
Yes, like they're literally the exact same time, simply a day ahead of them.
That's so random. But
That
hey,
is,
bragging rights.
yeah,
Yep.
and hey, good for them. So, I have an interesting question for you, Trish.
Yes, go ahead, Mike.
Do you know what the time zone in space is?
Does space have a time zone? I've never thought about that before.
So we basically, we set time zones on a
Uh-huh.
24-hour day because that's roughly what a rotation of the Earth is. It's slightly less, which is what gives us, of course, leap day every 4
Right.
years. And when you're in space, you observe many sunrises and sunsets in a 24-hour period. Unless, of course, you were one of the Apollo astronauts on the moon, in which case you experience none of these.
Oh, this is so fascinating.
So, how do you calculate time while you're in space? The answer is you basically operate on the time zone of either from where you were launched or your mission control.
I was going to say it either has to be, Houston, or it's going to be shoot out of where is it in Florida? Now I'm drawing a blank.
Kennedy Space Center.
Yeah, Kennedy Space Center.
Yeah. And I would think, at least, for American astronauts in space, we would probably go off of Johnson Space Center in Houston.
Right.
So they would be on Central Time. I mean, we're only talking an hour's difference. That's not that extreme. It's not like a Hawaii and Kirimati situation.
Right.
Like you're a day
24
off.
hours.
Right. So it makes sense because you want your team to be in sync with the astronauts' clocks,
Yes.
and so it just that actually makes sense.
Hmm.
As we are diving further into space, though, this creates a very even more interesting situation because there's a planet that we're currently doing a lot of exploration on.
Hmm.
So, what about Mars time?
Are we gonna? Are we just going to create like standard time on Mars and section it up
Well,
like we do on Earth?
I don't know ultimately, like, if whenever we colonize there, I'm not sure how that's going to work. But see, on Mars, a day lasts about 2.7% longer
Hmm.
than a day on Earth. And so, what they've done is the researchers and stuff who are working on various related Mars projects set their clocks forward, their daily schedule shift about 40 minutes every day to compensate for this because they need to take advantage of when there's sunlight on the sections of Mars that they're exploring so that their rovers can use the solar power from the sun.
Interesting. Now, are these time zones in space going to be changed or adjusted as we start to have more countries, putting people into space? Because, of course, you have China now launching, or they're at least looking at launching humans into space. You had the Soviets, obviously Russia, and Russia now launching individuals. So does it go based on that time zone as well, where they launch?
Yeah, I would imagine that basically when you have, whoever's launched you up there is whose time you follow.
Whoever's launched you.
Yeah. Now, that being said, I would assume, and this is where I'm just making an assumption, I guess the International Space Station probably operates on American time. So it would go through Johnson Space Center in
Hmm.
Houston. I would assume that would just,
That would make sense.
yeah, when you start getting into other countries, and I would assume they just, as they're launched, they operate on their own time. And then when they hop aboard the ISS, they're like, oh, let's change our clocks.
Yeah, to that Houston time or Kennedy Space Center time. Hmm.
Yeah.
Interesting. I don't know why I never thought about space requiring a time zone. It makes sense,
Yeah,
but
because you got to know, what time. You're like, oh, hey, we're up here. Or it's time for us to go home. What time are we leaving?
well, and there's no like night and day on the space. Like you have to create your own schedule. So
Right,
interesting.
because you're seeing sunrise and sunsets throughout the day, so that
Yeah.
that messes up your circadian rhythms. I mean, the concept of time and space definitely exists because you need to be aware of not so much the actual minutes and seconds in a day, but the minutes and
Hmm.
seconds of what you're doing. Like if you're going out on a spacewalk or something like that, you are cognizant of the amount of time that you have.
Right. Yes.
You know,
It's fascinating. Well, and what if, there suddenly ceased to be time, which kind of rolls into the next segment, which is all about James Bedford. On January 12th, 1967, he is the first human to be cryogenically frozen.
that is definitely one way to freeze time.
It does no longer exists until suddenly, hopefully, you get revived, and then you have to go through that whole paradox of understanding where you are and when you are. January 12th is actually known as Bedford Day in honor of this man. And who was he? Well, he was an American psychology professor at the University of California, and he actually wrote several books on occupational counseling that you can read. He died at the age of 73 after suffering from kidney cancer that had then traveled into his lungs. And actually, the choice to be preserved was entirely his. In the 1960s, there was this push for the exploration of this type of science, which you don't really think about, right? You would think that this kind of technology would be later in the 80s or even 90s, but in the 1960s, there was actually an organization known as the Life Extension Society. And they had an advertisement that said for the very first person to try their process, they would have the process completed for free. And he wrote into his will that this was something he wanted to have done. So his family had actually wanted cremation, but nope, they decided to abide by his wishes. And so when he died, he was interned in the special procedure for freezing a human.
Interesting. Yeah, you brought up a good point there. I would not have thought back in the 60s cryogenics being a thing, really.
Yeah,
That's interesting to realize it started that early because it does almost seem like more of an 80s or even a 90s thing, just because like the concept may have been there, but I wouldn't have thought that the technology would have been at that point.
right. And they were, I mean, I guess doctors and scientists were looking at doing experiments with sub-zero temperatures, and they were looking at preserving certain tissues. So, for example, it's very common nowadays for people to freeze their eggs or sperm for reproductive purposes later on, especially if they're going through very intensive cancer treatments. But the idea of freezing a whole person, you don't necessarily think of it already starting in the 60s. And unfortunately, the process that Mr. Bedford went through It likely caused ice crystals to damage his brain. So even though
Ooh.
to this day he is still frozen, they likely can't revive him, or if they did ever possibly try and revive him, there would be considerable damage and it just wouldn't be a possibility, really. But they keep him frozen and they are respecting his wishes and they are using his process to better modify modern procedures.
That is interesting. Do we know like how many popsicles are floating around there at the place in Arizona?
As of the most recent number I could find was 2014. So who knows how many more have been added in the last 7 years? Well, now 7 years, I guess. But we have 250 people have been cryogenically preserved in the United States. And there's about 1,500 people who have signed up to also have their remains preserved. As of 2016, there are 4 facilities around the world where you can have this process done. There are 3 in the United States and 1 in Russia.
Of course.
Yeah.
Of course Russia has the other one.
Well, you would think Russia would have more. Or Canada. It's so cold. We have the perfect facilities.
I mean, I'm just looking at this as another the space race from the '60s. It's like, hey, how
Yes.
many people can we freeze here?
Right? If the Americans are doing it, we can do it too.
Something that is interesting here in Florida that happens during the winter is, we have iguanas that run
Mhm.
around here. Iguanas, because they're cold blooded, they require the outside temperature to kind of help, regulate their body temperature.
Right.
When it gets cold down here in Florida, which it does get cold, when it starts to get in like the 40s or even the 30s, especially at night, the iguanas, because they're cold blooded, they will basically freeze up and they will start falling out of trees.
Oh no. It's raining iguanas.
It's raining iguanas. It happens usually in January and February. They have to advise people, like, leave them, let them be, don't
Right.
mess with them. They're not dead. And once it kind of warms up enough, their
They
body
will revive.
begins to they revive themselves. Like their bodies are still processing main bodily functions like breathing and stuff.
Right.
But they're still alive. And
Mhm.
in fact, because if you go and handle one when they're frozen, it doesn't take much for them to warm back up. And so sometimes just you're touching them will do that. Well, now you've gone from just, resting in a hibernated state to this giant human is holding me. I don't know what I'm going to do. So the iguana might attack you. So
Oh, I'd
it's
freak
it's
out.
best it's best just to leave them and let them be. And if they're just like chilling in your backyard, let them be.
Yep.
They'll be fine.
I need to get to Florida to experience this. And iguanas aren't the only creature that can go through this process. The scientists have done quite extensive research with frogs and viruses, so they can survive this freezing, thawing situation.
Interesting. And
Yeah,
the other good thing is if you make it to Florida in like January or February, it gets you out of the cold Canadian winter.
right. It'll actually kind of it'll be cool for you, but it'll feel nice, right?
Yeah, it'll be like what springtime probably to you, depending on what time of with your luck, you're gonna the time you come to Florida, we're gonna get hit with like one of these deep, deep cold fronts where like the high is like 48 degrees or something for the day.
Right, which is still
Which
really
is
nice for me because I think
yeah.
it's almost that temperature today here. So, but there's a few other notable people that have been frozen that I thought you might
Oh
find
really?
interesting. So, of course, James Bedford, obviously first man, very important for scientific advancement. Bedford Day, right? But
Mhm.
there's a few other people, and most of them are actually attached to this organization, which would make sense, right?
Right.
We have Thomas Donaldson, who's a mathematician, and his ideas about death are even stranger than one would think about. He believed that even though people were dead, their brains continued to exist and had functionality, and that we just don't have the technology to access that yet. For his sake, let's hope that's true. He died in 2006, and we only assume that he's been cryogenically frozen. He made that wish known, and there was no actual burial according to the family. So we hope that's what's going on with him.
Yeah, that's an interesting point he makes about bodies being alive or dead. That the brains may still have function because, like, I know stories you hear back when beheadings or
Right.
a thing, a method of execution of heads, dismembered heads, blinking, or even trying to talk or whatever. So it's interesting to know how long the brain potentially still survives after a person dies. So I guess in theory, maybe if you could freeze somebody quick enough, you
That you would
could
still
preserve
have
some
that.
sort of.
Well, and it's all electrical impulses, right?
Right, and then
And
that's the other thing. Some people say, those stories of beheadings or whatnot are simply just involuntary muscle spasms or whatever, and that there is no functionality. So it's if that's what he believed, it's interesting for him to see, and maybe one day when we thaw him out, we will.
we'll find out.
Hopefully, his brain did not get ice crystallized in a bad case of freezer burn like Mr. Bedford.
Yes. Well, they actually have changed the process in the 1980s so that it no longer creates those ice crystals. So anyone
That's
frozen before the 1980s theoretically could have ice crystal damage to the sensitive brain tissue. But all these individuals later on after the 80s, they theoretically should be fine.
That's good because I hate it when I go to the freezer and I get something out and it's been in there for a while and it's
Just
freezer burnt. I'm
freezer
like,
burn, you're like, ugh,
yeah.
no.
Like now I'm hungry and annoyed.
Very true. So can you imagine waking up? You'd be like, man, now I still have this disease and I'm annoyed.
Yeah, and I'm brain dead.
Yeah.
So thanks for waking me up. Get me a blanket.
There's a man whose name is FM 2030. He legally changed his name because it was to reflect his goal of living to be 100, and 2030 would have been his 100th birthday. He was actually born, and I hope I don't butcher this, but it is Firandun M. Estefandri. So FM
Yeah.
2030. He was cryogenically frozen because he believed that people would soon develop synthetic organs and body parts that would make the notion of death a thing of the past, that basically we would, be able to become kind of android hybrid people. Yeah, he died in 2000 at the age of 69 to pancreatic cancer. So sadly, it was 30 years too soon before his 100th birthday. The most interesting one I came across, and this one's just bizarre, is Dora Kent. And it's a very sad tale. So her son Saul was a board member of the Alcor Life Extension Foundation, so the organization that first froze Mr. Bedford.
Right.
And at 1987, at the age of 84, she came down with a fatal case of pneumonia and she was unable to recover. So, of course, she's after that 1980 change in the process. So, theoretically, hopefully, her brain tissue is okay.
Okay.
When it was looked like when it was assumed that she was dying, right? She was brought to the Alcor facility so they could freeze her. And they did with no doctor present. And when a coroner later inspected her headless body, Alcor removed the head for scientific purposes, we're assuming. It wasn't very clear why that happened or how they're planning on bringing her back after decapitation. But the coroner first agreed with pneumonia assessment and then reversed his decision and said he thought that she was murdered. So certain metabolites found in her body led him to believe that she was alive when they had started to freeze her. And he demanded her head for further testing, and the Alcor company refused to produce it. And some of the Alcor members were actually arrested, but nothing ever came of it, and no one was ever charged with her murder.
So
it's like an unsolved mystery.
so he decapitated his mom and then froze her?
Well, I guess she was already alive when they started the freezing process. And then somewhere along the freezing process decided to decapitate her. And no one knows where her head is, which is really uneasy to say.
That creates a big problem, when you decide to unfreeze her if you can't find her head.
Yeah, right? You're what's happening here?
That's like when you open a bottle to drink and you can't find the lid to put back on it. I mean, that's kind of a problem.
That's a problem.
Ooh.
The Alcor vice president, he also decided to get frozen. His name's Jerry Leaf. And in 1991, he died of a heart attack. So when he died, they put him on ice right away, I guess.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense that he would be frozen. I mean,
yeah, you would think the vice president of the company that created the process would want to go through the process. I'd be a little concerned after, the whole decapitation thing, but okay. Another notable person is Ted Williams. His son, John Henry Williams, was adamant that this is what his father wanted. He wanted to be preserved and brought back in the future to allow his whole family to be together again, and they could be reunited when technology and medicine made it possible. However, Ted's will said something very different. It said that he wanted, to be cremated. And his daughter, by his first wife, actually took the son to court over the matter, where the son produced a family pack signed on a cocktail napkin and said, nope, this is what he wanted. You're kind of thinking, why would he have his last will and testament on a cocktail napkin after he had already had a legal will drafted? But after much debate, the napkin pack was allowed and Ted was frozen.
I remember this when this happened, because Ted Williams was a iconic baseball player for the Boston Red Sox here in America. And I remember this whole thing. Like, I don't remember all the exact details when it was happening. And I just, this whole thing was definitely strange. Now, didn't his son wind up dying? I think maybe a few years later after Ted, because I remember Boston had the All-Star game in 1999, and they brought him out, and he threw out I think the first pitch or something for that game. And I want to say it wasn't too much longer after that when Ted Williams died, but his son died just not too much longer after that, I believe.
Yeah, so his son, Ted's son, stayed true to his word, and John Henry Williams also got frozen. He ended up dying of leukemia on March 6, 2004, and he's also at the Alcor facility in Scottsdale, Arizona.
Interesting. Yeah, Ted Williams died July 5th, 2002. So
so 2 years later.
Shortly thereafter, yeah.
So he honored the family pack on the napkin, and they're both frozen in Scottsdale. And now what is most noticeably missing from this list, because everyone believes this to be true, but Walt Disney is not frozen. Despite the persisting rumors, Walt Disney's not frozen. After his death in 1966, he's interned at Forest Lawn Memorial Park in Glendale, California.
I feel like there's a tie-in with Elsa and Frozen that they're missing out.
Totally.
I'd like to freeze this conversation here for a second, and if we could go back for just a moment to Mr. Fleming. Did you know that he designed Canada's first postage stamp?
I don't actually think I knew that. Huh.
Yes. So in addition to coming up with time zones, and he was very involved in the Canadian railroad system, he also designed the first Canadian stamp.
That is fascinating.
And do you know what the time zone for St. Kitts and Nevis in the Leeward Islands is?
Right now?
Yes.
No, that is something I do not know.
It is Atlantic Standard Time. Now, I have no idea what time zone they operated on in 1755, but I can tell you that on January 11th, 1755, one Mr. Alexander Hamilton was born there. Yes. So if anybody had a good 2020,
I think it was Hamilton.
We can all agree it was Mr. Hamilton. I think that was one of the main things that got people through all the quarantine and everything in 2020. It's funny because it's we had Tiger King right when the quarantine and everything started, and that carried people through for a few months, and then Hamilton got released on Disney Plus. So that kind of took everybody, because everybody watched that 18 times, or maybe 1,776 times perhaps, through that quarter. And then of course we had the new season of The Mandalorian
to get us through the last. So I mean, what's 2021 gonna hold?
I don't know, but I am interested in learning more about what happened back in 1920 on January 10th, because I do believe the Treaty of Versailles took effect, officially ending World War I.
That is true, and that effectively starting World War II, as I always like to say.
Which is funny, because we say in retrospect, of course, that it ended World War I, but at that point it was just World War, because we didn't know we were going to have another one 20 years later.
Yeah, the Great War to end all wars. Yeah, it took quite a while for the Treaty of Versailles to actually be amended. There was lots of conferences going on, and really France was very, very upset at Germany, and they really wanted to hold Germany accountable doesn't make a whole lot of sense because Germany didn't even start World War I. It was Austria, Hungary, and Serbia. And, because more powerful countries took over, so you start to have, it starts between Austria, Hungary, and Serbia, obviously, but then their allies start to pile in and support one another. And eventually the stronger allies take over that conflict from those two original countries. And you effectively have kind of the England versus Germany dynamics. And then, thankfully, the United States kind of hopped in there at the end, and we're able to end the war in 1918. But then it takes the 2 years to come up with all of the stipulations that Germany is going to have to surrender, or agree to, I should say, to take responsibility for this war. And the German people themselves are very upset. So there's things like they have to give up area in the Rhineland. They have to pay France an extraordinary amount of money to cover the war damages. They have to not have a large standing army. They can't have, a navy over so many ships. And so the German people are really choked by this Treaty of Versailles, and they don't think that it's fair, and they become very angry. A lot of them feel very disenfranchised in the world in terms of world politics, and they become really poor. And so you start to have poverty affecting the population of Germany. And then I always tell my students, anytime you have people that are, feeling disenfranchised, they're feeling like they don't have any power in terms of the world stage, and they're hungry and starving, you're going to have a change in the direction of your country, however that unfolds, whether it's like a revolution or a revolt or whatever. And so Germany is going to basically stand up. They all start to, we all know this now, they all start to listen and be motivated by a young Adolf Hitler, who really rallies them, uses this anger, uses this hurt that they have over the injustice that they feel the Treaty of Versailles created. And he's going to use that and say, yeah, we're going to make Germany powerful, and gets voted in as chancellor, I believe, in 1937. And really, we start to see Germany then in secret raising their army and building up their navy again and taking back the Rhineland. And Adolf Hitler just starts taking back the land that they had given up in the Treaty of Versailles. And nobody wanted another world war. So they allowed him, right? The other governments, particularly Britain at this time, just kind of appeased him and let him take what he wanted. And then, he gets a little too greedy and takes Poland in 1939. And that's kind of the final straw. And we march into World War II.
Yeah. When you look at it that way, it was almost like it really just kind of indirectly hit a pause button for 20 years, and then we wound up having an even bigger war.
Yeah. It's like, well, if you think about it, like 20 years of resentment and 20 years of feeling like you didn't receive any justice, 20 years of effectively being poor and your economy being decimated. Yeah, it doesn't go so well.
Well, that was interesting, to say the least. Thank you for the history lesson, Trish. Let me ask you this. Do you know what Band-Aid, chapstick, and jacuzzis all have in common?
Band-Aids, chapstick, and jacuzzis. I'm going to say that they all have something to do with liquid. I don't know.
Well, I guess in a sort of a way you could go with that route. Band-Aids cover bloody, so there's liquid. Chapstick, there has to be some sort of a liquid-ish.
What's like a semi-solid state?
Yeah, and jacuzzi
There's water. Come on, give it to me, man.
They are all basically, generalized trademarks that people use.
Oh, that is true. Okay. I did, yeah.
Give me a Band-Aid. Well, you really wanted an adhesive bandage.
Right. It's like tissue and Kleenex, like facial tissue and Kleenex.
Exactly. And one of the most iconic generic terms for a flying disc is, of course, a Frisbee. Frisbee is actually owned by the Wham-O company, and they began producing Pluto Platters, as they were known at the time, back in January of 1957.
Wow. So that's a long time for a Frisbee to be around.
Can you imagine a Frisbee flying for the last 70 years? As a side note, back to the generalized, generic terms,
Mhm.
uh, and referencing back to something we discussed in our previous episode about other things that are dropped at the stroke of midnight on New Year's Eve, aspirin is technically a Bayer trademark for.
Oh, acetaminophen.
No,
Or no,
that's
that's
Tylenol.
Tylenol. This is why I don't teach science.
No, you're good. I'm wanting to make sure I get my
Your
phonetics out and I have
phonetics.
my mouth warmed up to properly say acetalicylic acid.
Oh, salicylic acid. Yeah.
Yes, because you probably know it by that name better up there, because in most of Europe and in Canada, aspirin is a registered trademark of Bayer. But
Right.
here in America, we simply just call them aspirin.
Right.
Back to Whammo. So Whammo's first successful toy was the hula hoop, and in fact, Whammo sold in the first 4 months. They sold over 25 million hula hoops.
Wow. There's a lot of people. Wasn't it sold as like an exercise thing first?
It was originally based on exercise hoops made out of bamboo.
Interesting.
Yeah, they were originally made out of bamboo, and then they started making them out of plastic, made it a toy, and sold a ton of them. Back in the 30s, this guy named Walter Morrison and his, at the time, girlfriend would go on to be his wife, were tossing a popcorn can lid back and forth. And as they were tossing it, at one point the lid became dented and they realized it flew better. And so he was on to something and went through several different variations on this design and eventually wound up selling them rights to what he called Pluto Platters to Whammo. Whammo then kind of took the product and they worked on it a bit and came up with a little bit of a better version of it. And the name Frisbee actually came from students over at Yale who would yell Frisbee as they were tossing these pie pans. Basically, is what, a Frisbee sort of at the time kind of looked a little more like a pie pan.
Hmm.
Yell Frisbee as they were throwing them so people would not get hit. Kind of like when you're golfing and you have an errant golf shot and you yell four.
Right.
You're wanting, hey, Frisbee.
It's like you wonder where they came up with that name, though.
Well,
Very random.
it is not random.
Oh,
The name Frisbee comes from a local pie company in Connecticut named the Frisbee Pie Company. And the company wound up going out of business in the 60s. And
but the name lives on.
the name lives on. And in fact, in late 2016, Connecticut resident and historian and Frisbee player Dan O'Connor acquired the rights, licensing, and distribution rights to the Frisbee Pie Company and relaunched the company and sells pies based on the original Frisbee Pie Company recipe.
What? That is a very interesting turn of events, connecting it all together. It's interesting though that they decided to go with the nickname Frisbee rather than Pluto Platter, because you would think during this whole space race era of time and history that Pluto Platter would be such a catchy name to keep.
You would think, and especially because over the years, as Mr. Morrison was developing the product, he worked with other business partners and they'd try some different ideas before he ultimately sold it to Whammo. And as the product got reinvented several times, the name changed. At one point, they were known as Whirlio Way and Flying Saucer.
Oh, I can't see. Can you imagine trying to play like a game of Frolf with a name like that? That doesn't go together.
Yeah, so it's like Frisbee kind of works. And the Frisbee was one of the original 17 toys to be inducted into the National Toy Hall of Fame back in.
That is a Hall of Fame that I really want to check out.
Yeah, absolutely. And that was back in 1998. And as a side note, this year's inductees to the Toy Hall of Fame, well, I should say last year for 2020, the
Right.
inductees were Baby Nancy dolls, Sidewalk Chalk, and Jenga.
See, and the sidewalk chalk really stands out because, of course, there was that period of time when it became spring into summer where everyone was outside during COVID, and sidewalk chalk got sold out here in the city of Edmonton. Like you could not find a pack of sidewalk chalk anywhere.
I remember seeing postings and on social media and whatnot of families drawing on their driveways, or
Mhm.
maybe going to their neighbor's house and spreading the love and drawing on their driveway or their sidewalk or whatever. So it was really kind of cool to
Yep,
see,
that's
people
a fitting toy.
come together, and that it's fitting that it got inducted in 2020
Yeah.
like that.
It's kind of funny to think, though, that a piece of plastic was all it took for people to be entertained in the 1950s, where during COVID, everyone was complaining about being bored. And it's like, we literally have this vast library of entertainment to watch and keep ourselves busy and occupied.
If you think
But
that piece of plastic led to an interesting time period, let me tell you about one of Whammo's other toys that they sold.
okay.
The Super Ball. So a Super Ball was basically created by a chemist. He discovered this compound that created the super bouncy ball. And one day, Lamar Hunt, who was in charge of what was then known as the American Football League, that later became the American Football Conference, which makes up part of the NFL. At the time, they
Mhm.
just played an AFL NFL World Championship game, is what they called it. Well, one day he saw his kids playing with a Super Ball and sent a letter to the NFL commissioner saying we should call this game the Super Bowl. And he was originally sending it as a joke, but the media picked up on
Oh,
it and ran with it. And so the name Super Bowl has stuck ever
has
since.
stuck ever since. Oh, jinx.
And what does not get stuck, however, is your Super Bowl. And in the 1960s, Whammo created a Super Bowl that was about the size of a bowling ball and dropped it.
Holy moly.
There's some holy and some moly coming with the rest of the
Oh,
story.
no.
They dropped this off a 23-story building in Australia where it completely destroyed a car on its second bounce.
No. Oh, my goodness.
Yes.
But the ball was perfectly intact.
I assume so, but I probably had to sell a few extra hula hoops, frisbees, and Super Balls to pay off that one.
Oh, man, I paid that one, yeah.
Not good.
Oh, my.
Not good at all. What was good, though?
No.
January 8th, 1935, in Tupelo, Mississippi, Elvis Aaron Presley was born.
Yeah, and changes the music industry forever
Absolutely.
once he gets going. It's actually kind of interesting how Elvis rose to fame because he really was, not a very significant person. He was born into poverty, basically. And after World War II, well, actually during World War II, there was this rave about people recording records to send to the soldiers overseas, and you could record a message. And so these message recording studios then open up into people who were musically inclined, and you could record yourself kind of jamming with your friends. And Elvis decides to actually make a record for his mother. And he went and he paid $4 to record a few songs as a birthday present. And then a few years later, the owner, Sam Phillips, of this Memphis recording studio, owned by Sun Records, he remembers Elvis and actually calls him back into the studio and asks him to kind of do a jam session. And he takes off in 1946 from there on.
He's the perfect example of the right guy in the right place at the right time, and really
Mhm.
becomes the first global music superstar.
Yep. And we often talk about, the Beatles come up as changing the way that music is recorded and shared and just the style of music. But actually, a lot of these individuals that we think of in the late 60s were already being influenced by Elvis from the 50s,
Mhm.
because in 1955, so he starts kind of recording in 1946, but he becomes just by 1955 really this sensation. And it's not only that people really liked his music, it was so controversial for the time because being from the South, he was exposed to Black music, basically Black culture. And
Mhm.
so his music meshes basically what we like white music of the time that was very popular on the radio, as well as this Black Southern African influenced music that a lot of white America hadn't heard or been exposed to. And so he
Yeah,
basically creates this whole new genre.
He really does, because when you look at Elvis now, you really just kind of look at it as music. You don't
Mhm.
look at it with the way the music was at the time. But he really, he creates this kind of rockabilly sound where he takes elements of black music, he takes elements of country music, elements of gospel music, elements of
Yep.
rhythm and blues, and he really kind of merges them and creates a very unique sound that you don't really you sort of get now with music, where you do kind of have genres that merge, but at the time it really stood out
Mhm.
because there was nothing really like it.
No, it was a brand new genre of music that he just created.
That he started recording on a national level, basically in the mid '50s, and here we
Mhm.
are now, some 65 years later, and his music is still very popular. And it makes you wonder, because I've had this thought, because I love one thing I've missed a lot about 2020 was not being able to go to concerts. I love going to concerts.
Mhm.
I got to go to a couple right before everything shut down, but I love going to see older acts, music icons.
Well, and I think the older acts, they didn't have the modern technology to kind of lean against. Like, you really had to be good, right?
Right.
You
Yeah.
had to have talent, like, not that I'm not saying that modern singers don't have talent, but we have, technology that can clean things up, or you can lean against, or you can
Right.
use to make your sound better. But back in the 50s, 60s, 70s, it was all your own talent.
Right, you had to do something in one take, and if you I mean,
Mhm.
yeah, you eventually start getting into splicing tapes and stuff, and you could take the first verse from this recording and merge it with a second verse from a different recording or something, but you'd have to, get the stuff together. Performing live was different. Now
Mhm.
we have, technology where when you're singing live, it can correct you as you're singing, and it can
Right.
sound on pitch and whatnot. But back then, you didn't have that. But I just find it interesting because I look at the music scene today, and with how diversified and specific genres and stuff are. Like, I know my Spotify told me I listened to like 165 music genres in
Yeah, mine
2020,
was about the same too. I was quite surprised.
and I'm like, there's 160 genres, period. Let alone
Yeah.
I listen to 160 of them. And I just think I'm like, what music now are people going to be listening to 60 years from now?
Mhm.
Or are they still going to be listening to Elvis or the Beatles or Michael Jackson or what? Like,
Mhm.
what artists have that lasting legacy? Because, like, I mean, we still have Beethoven and Mozart and people like that, and they go back hundreds of years ago, and we still
Right.
have their music. So I think it's going to be interesting, and it brings up an interesting debate that we can have about music, the music business, and stuff. Because I've had the thought, and I think we'll probably get into this a little bit more in December. I don't want to get into it right now so much.
Mhm.
When we celebrate the birth of one Miss Taylor Swift,
Right.
I can make the point she's probably like the last major global superstar, because when you have Spotify and customized individual streams, you don't have the presence of radio or MTV to influence music. And
Yeah.
so I find it interesting to see who 5, 10 years from now is going to be able to sell out stadiums on a consistent basis.
Right, and are we still gonna celebrate and experience music in that same way?
Yeah. Yeah. So I think that that'll be a fun conversation to have. Do you know
Mhm.
what Elvis's last meal was before he died?
Okay, I know the, like, rumor that wasn't it his famous, peanut butter and banana sandwich?
It was not, although that was certainly one of his favorites. Supposedly, the last food he ate before he died was 4 scoops of ice cream and 6 chocolate chip cookies, which
Oh, I mean, if you're gonna go, it's kind of a nice last
that's
meal.
that's not a bad last meal. I mean, it's better than getting some nasty something or whatever. So at least he went out on a good note.
You were yeah.
Well, at least he went out on a good meal. He didn't go out on a good note because they found the guy on a toilet dead. But
Not the most, modest of places to be found.
yes, not the most dignified of exits, but at least he had a good last meal. And that takes us to our last thing to discuss today, because I know this is a subject you are deeply passionate about, because January 13th is National Sticker Day. Before you say anything, we call them by their proper name of
No, you don't.
of decals.
No, what is a decal?
A decal is a sticker that you put on something. Now,
No,
what do you crazy Canadian Canuckers call them?
dear decals. They're decals. You put
Decals.
a decal on your car, or like you gave me one of your awesome Bob Ross stickers for Christmas,
Thank
and
you.
I will put that uh, decal on my laptop. I'm not going to put a decal on my laptop.
So you're going to put a decal on your laptop because you've learned the proper way to say it, or because it's an American sticker, so it's a decal?
No, no. I'm going to put it's my decal. What did I say? Now I'm all confused.
You called it a decal.
No, the decal is not right. It's a decal. I'm going to put a decal on my computer.
You said you're going to put a decal on your computer, and I'm running with it.
Now
So
these words make no sense the more you say them over and over in your head.
I believe I have finally converted you. Now, if I can only convert the rest of Canada, we'll be in good shape.
It'll be fascinating as we go through recording this wonderful podcast together and sharing our cultural differences, what we each pick up from the other, or what we notice from the other. Right, like the other day when we were discussing some topics that we might wanted to include, I was saying resources, and you were saying that was wrong.
Well, yeah, because here in America we say resources,
and now and I said resources, and now I don't know if that's just a maritimism that I have, or if it's just a Trishism.
Right, because you grew up in Eastern Canada, and
Yeah.
Canada, much like America, depending where you grew up, you say certain things differently.
Right.
The one thing I can say, though, is unfortunately we are out of time for this week's episode, and we want to, again, thank you for joining us on the Time Machine as we travel through history, looking at the fun and unique things, and thank you for making it to the end of the episode, and if you didn't make it to the end, I hope you step on a Lego.
Oof, that's harsh, man, but true.
They didn't make it to the end, they didn't hear it anyway, so
yeah.
Step on 2 Legos.
Just those of you that are loyal to us know how serious we are.
Yes, and we hope that you don't step on a Lego because we like you.
We hope you have a wonderful rest of your week and that you join us again next week for a whole new episode.